Two men sit at the defense table in tailored suits, flanked by the most expensive criminal attorneys money can buy. Roy Black, Albert Krieger, Martin Weinberg, a legal team that costs more per hour than most Americans earn in a month. Across from them, the United States government has assembled the largest drug trafficking prosecution in the history of South Florida. 27 cooperating witnesses, 75 tons of cocaine, $2.1 billion in revenue. The jury comes back, not guilty, on every major count. The prosecutors sit in silence. The defendants embrace their attorneys. Outside the courthouse, supporters from Little Havana, the neighborhood where both men grew up, are cheering in the streets, honking car horns, waving Cuban flags. To them, this is not the acquittal of two drug lords. It is a victory for the community, a triumph of their boys over the overreaching American government. The celebration lasts approximately 6 months. That is how long it takes the FBI to discover that the jury foreman had been paid $500,000 in cash to deliver the verdict. The men in the tailored suits were Augusto Willy Falcon and Salvador Sal Magluda. They were high school dropouts. They were champion powerboat racers. They were beloved philanthropists in the Cuban exile community, and for nearly 15 years, they ran the most profitable cocaine syndicate on the Eastern Seaboard, not from the shadows, but in broad daylight, on ESPN, on the front pages, in the VIP suites of the Mutiny Hotel. They believed their money could buy anything. For a very long time, they were right. Augusto Guillermo Falcon was born on September 1st, 1955, in Alquizar, a small agricultural town in the Havana province of Cuba. His family worked a farm, modest, self-sustaining, and entirely theirs. Then Fidel Castro's revolution reached the countryside, and it wasn't theirs anymore. The government seized the land. The Falcons became tenants in their own country. In 1966, when Willie was 11 years old, the family fled to Miami with whatever they could carry. He landed in Little Havana, a neighborhood packed tight with families who had experienced the same theft. The culture that formed there was defined by a single word: lucha, the struggle. It was a community built on the shared understanding that everything they had once owned had been taken by force, and that the institutions of power, whether in Havana or Washington, could not be trusted to protect them. Trust lived inside the family, inside the neighborhood, inside the circle. Everything outside was a system to be navigated, not believed in. Falcon enrolled at Miami Senior High School, where he was immediately recognizable, magnetic, funny, physically commanding, the kind of person who walked into a room and rearranged the social gravity. He was not a good student. He was an exceptional operator. By his mid-teens, he was selling marijuana around the school, making more in a week than his parents made in a month. He dropped out before graduation. The classroom had nothing left to teach him. What pulled him deeper was not greed, but ideology, or at least the version of ideology that circulated through Miami's militant exile circles in the 1970s. Falcon became involved with anti-Castro paramilitary networks, and through those connections, he was introduced to Rafael Chichi Quintero, a CIA asset and prominent figure in the Cuban resistance. The work was simple: move product, generate cash, buy weapons for the Contras. Cocaine wasn't a drug. It was a funding mechanism for a righteous war. That framing lasted exactly as long as the money stayed small. Once Falcon realized what cocaine could buy, not just arms, but land, status, influence, everything his family had lost when they fled Alquizar, the ideology evaporated. What remained was ambition, pure, uncut, and limitless. Salvador Magluta was born 13 months before Falcon on November 5, 1954, in Bajucal, Cuba. His family operated bakeries, a small, stable, middle-class existence that the revolution dismantled with bureaucratic efficiency. In 1961, at the age of 7, Magluta was sent to the United States through Operation Pedro Pan, a mass Catholic Church-sponsored exodus that placed over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children with foster families and relatives across America. He was 7 years old. He arrived without his parents. He eventually reunited with his family in Miami, where they rebuilt their bakery business in Little Havana. But the psychological architecture of that separation, a child ripped from his parents by political upheaval, deposited alone into a foreign country, left a permanent imprint. Magluta learned early that security was not something the world provided. It was something you built, tracked, and controlled with absolute precision. He met Falcon at Miami Senior High, but they occupied different worlds within it, where Willie was the social center of gravity, magnetic, instinctive, the kind of teenager who could sell anything to anyone. Sal was the quiet perimeter, watchful, analytical, already running numbers in his head. He saw the world in margins, logistics, and risk assessment. He understood before most people his age understood anything about money, that the person who controls the ledger controls the operation. He dropped out, worked briefly as an accountant at a bank, long enough to absorb the mechanics of deposits, withdrawals, and the institutional architecture of money, not long enough to accept what the legitimate world paid for that knowledge. When the opportunity came, Magluta didn't need ideology to justify it. He needed a spreadsheet. In 1978, a man named Jorge Valdez walked into their lives and changed everything. Valdez was a Cuban-American accountant who had traded a legitimate career at the Federal Reserve Bank for a far more lucrative one as a logistics coordinator for the Medellin cartel. He was drowning in product and needed reliable local distributors, men who were competent, culturally bonded to the exile community, and unlikely to attract the attention of homicide detectives. He invited Falcon and Magluta to the Mutiny Hotel in Coconut Grove, the unofficial headquarters of Miami's cocaine economy, and proposed a test. Handle the distribution of 30 kilograms of cocaine. The dynamics of the partnership crystallized in that single meeting. Magluta hesitated. He ran the numbers in his head, the legal exposure, the physical risk, the probability of interception. Falcon didn't hesitate at all. He looked at Valdez and said 3 words, "We do it." They moved the 30 kilos flawlessly and handed Valdez $1.3 million in profit. It was the most money either of them had ever touched, and it was a fraction of what was coming. The Colombians recognized that Falcon and Magluta possessed something exceedingly rare in the cocaine trade: operational discipline combined with community insulation. The Cuban exile networks of Little Havana were almost impenetrable to outside law enforcement. Informants couldn't be cultivated because the community's loyalty was tribal, not transactional. Falcon and Magluta exploited this ruthlessly, building a distribution network staffed exclusively by family members, childhood friends, and neighborhood loyalists. People who would rather face a prison sentence than betray the circle. They called themselves Los Muchachos, the boys. And within 2 years of that first 30-kilo test, they had become the primary U.S. distribution partners for not one, but both of Colombia's warring cartels, the Medellin and the Cali. In an industry defined by lethal tribal loyalty, where working with one cartel meant declaring war on the other, Falcon and Magluta achieved something no one else could: neutrality through indispensability. They changed the financial model, generating enough cash to purchase multi-ton shipments outright rather than taking them on consignment. By assuming all the risk, they eliminated the cartel's leverage and dictated their own terms. Their roles were perfectly complementary. Falcon was the ambassador, the man who flew to Colombia, shook hands with cartel leadership, negotiated prices, and maintained the vast human network that kept the product moving. Magluta was the architect, the man who structured the offshore shell companies, managed the stash houses, and tracked the movement of billions through coded ledgers and Panamanian bank accounts. Neither tried to do the other's job. Neither wanted to. And they had one rule that separated them from every other major trafficker in Miami during the bloodiest decade in the city's history: no unnecessary violence. Falcon's operational philosophy was explicit. You can't take a dead body to the bank. If a distributor owed money, Falcon's instinct was to front them more product so they could sell their way out of debt. If an associate became a liability, they severed business ties and moved on. They viewed themselves as CEOs, not gangsters. Diplomats, not enforcers. It was a philosophy that worked brilliantly, right up until the moment it didn't. By the mid-1980s, Los Muchachos had built something that defied every assumption about what a drug syndicate could look like. At its peak, the organization was importing over 75 tons of cocaine into the United States and generating more than $2 billion in revenue. They were clearing upwards of $100 million a year in profit. They were, by any reasonable financial metric, a Fortune 500 company, except they paid no taxes, answered to no board, and resolved disputes through means unavailable to legitimate corporations. The logistical infrastructure was staggering. Magluta established dummy corporations in the Bahamas, the Netherlands Antilles, and Panama to launder the cash. One of the Panamanian attorneys who helped incorporate their shell companies was a man named Guillermo Endara. In 1989, after the U.S. military invaded Panama and removed Manuel Noriega, the American government installed Endara as the country's new president. The revelation that the freshly minted U.S.-backed head of state had served as the corporate treasurer for a cocaine syndicate's money laundering fronts was an international embarrassment and a measure of just how deeply Los Muchachos had embedded themselves into the machinery of power. Domestically, their money colonized South Florida. They owned a massive cattle ranch south of Lake Okeechobee, with its own clandestine airstrip for receiving drug flights directly from Colombia. They acquired controlling interests in banks, using their own laundered deposits to issue commercial loans that financed construction companies, apartment complexes, and luxury real estate. The popular observation that the mob built Vegas, but cocaine built Miami was, in large part, a description of their specific investments. And none of it was hidden. That was the remarkable part. That was the part that revealed who they really were. Falcon and Magluta didn't operate in the shadows. They competed in nationally televised offshore powerboat races. Falcon racing for Team Cougar, Magluta for Team Seahawk. Falcon won the 1986 Offshore Challenge off the Florida Keys. Magluta won 3 national championships and was appointed to the governing commission of the American Powerboat Association. They appeared on ESPN. They gave interviews. They were celebrities. And the powerboats weren't just a hobby. They were the literal vehicles of their smuggling operation, custom built to outrun the Coast Guard while hauling cocaine from the Bahamas to the Florida coast. The racing was the purest expression of their shared psychology. They needed to be seen. They needed to be admired. Not in private, among their associates, but publicly, nationally, by the very society whose institutions they were corrupting. They were like gods in the doper community, a U.S. Marshals supervisor named Sean Convoy later observed. All the other smugglers talked about how invincible they were. Convoy's office had been building files on the pair for years. They didn't have enough for an indictment. Not yet. They funneled millions back into Little Havana, donations to Miami Senior High School, funding for local charities, direct financial assistance to struggling families. The community repaid them with absolute loyalty and complete silence. To the neighborhood, Los Muchachos were not criminals. They were the boys who made it, who beat the system, who came back and took care of their own. In late 1983, Falcon, who was actively importing thousands of pounds of cocaine through the Caribbean, was personally offended by the premise of Brian De Palma's Scarface. Believing it slandered the Cuban exile community, he forbade his associates from working on the Miami production. Then, when the film premiered, Falcon and his inner circle rented out a Las Vegas theater during a New Year's trip, watching Tony Montana's rise and fall while surrounded by actual cartel associates, laughing and cheering at the screen. They saw the movie as fiction. They saw themselves as something else entirely. For years, the operational doctrine of Los Muchachos had been discipline over spectacle, corruption over violence. That doctrine held as long as the system kept working, as long as the bribes landed, the judges cooperated, and nobody in their circle faced the kind of federal pressure that breaks men open. When that pressure finally arrived in the late 1980s, Falcon and Magluta discovered something about themselves they had never been forced to confront. Their nonviolence wasn't a moral conviction. It was a business preference. And business preferences change when the business is threatened. In September 1989, federal investigators subpoenaed Juan Acosta, a former attorney for the syndicate who had helped establish their Panamanian shell companies. Acosta knew the architecture. He knew the account numbers, the corporate names, the flow of money. Before he could testify, he was found dead in his Miami office. He never made it to the witness stand. It didn't stop there. Bernardo Gonzalez, a high school friend who had risen to become a logistics lieutenant managing Bahamian shipments, buckled under federal pressure and became a confidential informant. He provided the U.S. Marshals with the specific location of Magluta's safe house on Lagos Island. In June 1993, one day after Gonzalez's identity was revealed in open court, armed men arrived at his parents' home in West Dade. Both Bernardo and his brother Humberto, who had nothing to do with the organization, were gone by morning. 3 witnesses in total. The men who had built their reputation on being different, smarter, calmer, more civilized than the Griselda Blancos of the world, had revealed that the difference was only ever a matter of convenience. When the stakes rose high enough, they made the same calculations as everyone else. The witness killings accomplished something the organization never intended. They transformed the government's pursuit from a standard narcotics case into a personal institutional crusade. The Department of Justice was no longer simply trying to prosecute 2 drug traffickers. They were trying to protect the integrity of the federal system itself. But Falcon and Magluta couldn't see that distinction. They had spent 15 years buying off local cops, altering court records, and walking out of county jails through administrative manipulation. In 1988, Magluta, living as a fugitive from a 1979 state drug conviction, had been recognized and arrested by a detective in a Miami office supply store. Within 5 days, court records were mysteriously altered to indicate he had already served his sentence, and he walked out the front door of the county jail. That kind of experience teaches a man that every institution has a price, and it blinds him to the possibility that some institutions will burn themselves down before they let you buy them. When the 1996 federal trial arrived, the culmination of a 4-year investigation, 17-count indictment, and 27 cooperating witnesses, they didn't rely solely on their elite legal team. They did what they had always done. They reached for the checkbook. Jury foreman Miguel Moya received $500,000 in cash. The money arrived in bags, delivered after phone calls from an associate named Eddie. Moya's ex-wife would later testify that she watched her husband leave the house, receive a call, and return holding a physical bag of money. The purchase of the American justice system was that literal, that tactile. The verdict came back, not guilty on all major charges. Outside of the courthouse, Little Havana celebrated. Falcon and Magluta embraced their attorneys. For a brief euphoric moment, they believed they had won. They believed the system had confirmed what they had always suspected about themselves, that they were untouchable. They were wrong. And the next 6 years would prove it with devastating precision. The celebration of the 1996 acquittal was the last moment Falcon and Magluta occupied the same world. From that point forward, their paths diverged, slowly at first, then completely, driven by the same psychological differences that had made their partnership so effective and their downfall so inevitable. The FBI launched Operation Recoil within weeks of the verdict, a classified forensic investigation into the finances of the jury. Agents traced Moya's sudden, unexplainable purchases. A $198,000 home in the Florida Keys paid off in 3 months. A $31,000 speedboat directly back to the laundering network. An undercover agent named Jack Garcia, posing as a cartel associate, recorded Moya admitting to the bribe on a 15-minute videotape. But the true instrument of their destruction was not the FBI's surveillance. It was a handwritten notebook sitting in the trunk of a car. Sal Magluda, the man whose genius had built a $2 billion laundering apparatus, could not bring himself to stop keeping records. Even from federal detention, he maintained a meticulously coded physical ledger tracking $7.7 million in illegal payouts to lawyers, private investigators, family members, and bribed jurors. He entrusted this ledger to Marilyn Bonachea, his girlfriend of 27 years and chief financial proxy. In October 1996, police intercepted Bonachea's vehicle and found the ledger in her trunk. Magluta panicked. He paid Bonachea thousands of dollars to flee to New York and live in hiding. She lasted a year and a half before federal agents found her. Facing 200 years in prison, the 27-year loyalty shattered in a single conversation. Bonachea cooperated completely. She deciphered the coded ledger, wore a wire to meetings with Magluta's associates, and became the star witness in 6 federal trials. The book that Magluta could not bring himself to destroy, the document that Falcon and multiple attorneys had explicitly warned him to burn, became the Rosetta Stone that translated the entire conspiracy into prosecutable evidence. And then Magluta made it worse. In February 1997, during a separate passport fraud trial, the man who had once commanded a fleet of custom speedboats and the loyalty of hundreds simply told a courthouse guard he needed to retrieve something from his car and walked out the front door. He was a fugitive, the most wanted man in South Florida. A man with the resources and the connections to disappear to any non-extradition country on Earth within 48 hours. He checked into the Ritz-Carlton in Palm Beach, not a safe house in Central America, not a rented apartment under a false name, the Ritz-Carlton. He drove around in a Lincoln Town car. He refused to lower his standard of living by a single degree because for Magluta, the calculation had never really been about safety. It was about proving he could operate on his own terms, in his own city, while the entire federal government searched for him. The thrill of that proof was more intoxicating than freedom itself. In April 1997, 2 months after his escape, federal agents spotted the town car and pulled him over. Magluta was wearing a cheap synthetic disguise wig. As they pushed him onto the hood to handcuff him, the wig fell off his head. The man who had once been described as a god in the doper community was frantically claiming he was having a panic attack, while marshals told him the obvious. You can run, but you can't hide. In August 1999, a 47-count federal indictment landed against both men and 10 associates. Juror bribery, witness tampering, money laundering, and the orchestration of the witness murders. Here, at the final crossroads, the partnership's fundamental asymmetry revealed itself. Willie Falcon looked at the evidence. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the cooperating witnesses, Bonachea, Valdez, a cascade of former lieutenants who had chosen self-preservation over loyalty. And he did what Sal Magluda was constitutionally incapable of doing. He did the math. In 2003, Falcon accepted a plea deal, 1 count of money laundering, 20 years. He would serve 14. It was surrender, and he knew it. But Falcon had always been the pragmatist, the man who paid ransoms instead of ordering retaliations, who fronted product instead of dispatching enforcers. He chose survival over principle, because for him, survival had always been the principle. He walked out of prison in June 2017, but he had never become a naturalized U.S. citizen, a bureaucratic oversight that, in the end, cost him everything the plea deal was supposed to preserve. ICE detained him immediately. In November 2018, the government deported him to the Dominican Republic. The Dominican authorities, unwilling to host a notorious narco, quickly pressured him to leave. Today, Falcon lives as a free man in an undisclosed international exile, permanently banished from the city he spent his life trying to own. Magluta refused. He stood trial in 2002, fighting every charge with the same defiant compulsion that had driven him to keep the ledger, escape the courthouse, and hide at the Ritz-Carlton. The jury found him guilty on 12 counts. The judge, intent on making a statement about the sanctity of the American judicial system, handed down a sentence of 205 years. It was later reduced on appeal to 195. The difference was academic. Sal Magluda will die in federal custody. He is 71 years old, incarcerated at a high-security penitentiary in Pennsylvania after years at ADX Florence. the Supermax facility reserved for the most dangerous inmates in the federal system. His legal team has filed repeated petitions for compassionate release, citing chronic kidney disease, severe mental illness, and symptoms of dementia. All have been denied. His projected release date is the year 2166. The $2 billion fortune is gone, drained by decades of legal fees, government seizures, and the chaotic dissolution of their offshore accounts. The federal government seized over $16 million in real estate alone, apartment complexes, ranches, luxury condos, and, in one memorable inventory at a single Hialeah property, exactly 80 refrigerators, 80 washers, 80 dryers, 80 stoves, and 80 air conditioners. The paperwork of an empire reduced to an appliance manifest. The story of Willy, Falcon and Sal Magluda is not ultimately a story about cocaine. It is a story about what happens when two men become so successful at corrupting small systems that they convince themselves all systems are small. For 15 years, they were right. Local cops could be bought. Court records could be altered. Community loyalty could be purchased with philanthropy. Every institution they encountered confirmed their operating thesis, that power in America works the same way it worked in Cuba. Whoever has the most money makes the rules. The 1996 jury bribe was the logical endpoint of that belief, and it was the moment that belief collided with reality, because the federal government is not a local institution. It does not forget. It does not run out of funding. And when you humiliate it publicly, it does not move on. Falcon understood this eventually. He took the deal. He lost his country, but he kept his life. Magluta never understood it. He kept the ledger. He escaped the courthouse. He hid at the Ritz-Carlton. He fought every charge, and he will spend the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell, still the accountant, still keeping score. Except now, the only number that matters is the one on his sentence. 195 years.